most everybody here, but I'll introduce myself again. I'm Shinkyu Brian Cote. I'm the new priest in training. Emphasis on the training. I was ordained in February, so I'm very new priest. I've been giving talks for a while at my temple, so I've got more accustomed to that. The actual procedures here a little bit. Shocking. So, get to the talk. It's titled How to Pull a Goose from a Bottle. And a quick note on the way I usually give talks. I like to give a koan to sort of start things off and kind of give a focus to what I'm going to be talking about. And so, the official Riko once asked the Zen master Nansen if a man puts a gosling, a baby goose, into a bottle and feeds the gosling through the bottleneck until it grows and grows and becomes a full-grown goose, and then there's just no more room inside the bottle. How can the man get the goose out of the bottle without killing the goose or without breaking the bottle? Nansen! Riko! Nansen shouted. Yes, master, the official said at the start. See, Nansen said, the goose is out. I don't know if anyone's heard that koan before. We were talking about that a little bit yesterday, but we'll get to it. We're going to kind of circle around a bit. So, how did Nansen get the goose out of the bottle by just clapping his hands and shouting? The simple answer, sort of, is that we're not actually talking about a real goose getting stuck inside of a real bottle that we're not supposed to break and getting it out. But we're actually talking about our own lives and about how we think about ourselves, how we conceive of ourselves. Just repeating this story about this goose creates this mental image in our minds of a goose that's stuck in a bottle that can't get out, and we end up treating this story like it's actually happening in our lives. And actually, because we're thinking of a goose in a bottle that can't get out, there is a goose in a bottle that can't get out that's affecting our lives. So thoughts have a habit of doing that type of thing. So, what was Nansen's answer? He screamed at Riko, pulling him out of his thoughts and bringing him back to this present moment. And right here in this moment, the goose and the bottle and the getting stuck are all gone. He's actually pulled the goose from the bottle without breaking it. It's as simple as that. So, this is a kind of mental explanation of the koan. Put that aside for a second. I'm going to go through a whole other thing. I'm going to come back and it'll hopefully all make sense. So, to really get to the heart of the koan, I'd like to share my own journey through the dharma to illustrate how this type of koan can function in your own life. So one of the main issues, not the main issue in my practice and in my life for years, had been to do with my relationship with my next oldest brother. So there are three brothers in my family: Tom, the oldest, Tim, the middle child, and then me, Shinkyu, or Brian, the baby. Now, the thing to note is that my brother Tim, the middle brother, is autistic, so very autistic, almost incommunicado. He speaks just the little tiniest bit. And this can help explain a lot of things about me. In a Buddhist context, it helps explain my interest in meditation, a very early interest. I began when I was about 12 or 13, basically, all on my own, which I hear is odd, but that's me. I remember walking to a public library after school one day, and I was browsing through the shelves when I stumbled across a book on meditation. And it wasn't a completely new topic for me because I'd done a little bit of meditation when I was 4 or 5 as part of a karate class, but that didn't last. Yeah, it didn't last for so long, but an introduction to it. However, standing right there in the library, I was really interested in studying the mind, seeing what the mind could do, and meditation looked like an avenue towards that. When you grow up with a brother like mine, with the type of mind he has, you can become very interested in mind in general and in your own specifically. I'd also add that I had a particularly bad case of undiagnosed anxiety that lasted for years. I knew the word anxiety, but I didn't connect the symptoms that I had with that word for a very, very, almost an embarrassingly long amount of time. A lot of my early life, my hobbies and my occupations, I ad hoc ways of dealing with this anxiety that I didn't know that I had, or that I did know but didn't have a word for it. I would draw for hours, I would read for hours, bringing myself into a more calmer, focused state of mind, naturally, not planned out. And meditation went right along with that. I practiced mostly before bed. As I was lying down, I would progressively slow my breathing and cultivate this powerful flow of energy, quote unquote, that would zip around my body. And I couldn't tell you how long I would practice in any particular night, but I would always wear my energy down, that nervous energy that I would have accumulated throughout the day until I finally drifted off to sleep. And this practice continued for years, all the way through my teens and onward. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. We need to rewind to when I'm guessing I was probably 8 or 9 or 10, something like that. When on one particular day I stumbled across a film called The Circle of Iron, which it's not a good movie. Get that out of the way. But it was written by Bruce Lee with the express purpose of presenting Zen Buddhism to a Western audience. So, and the movie itself is structured like a koan. It presents the hero's journey, like Star Wars and The Matrix, some ancient myth in general. And then it twists it around at the end. And kind of shows you like a slap from an ancient Zen master that what you've been looking for this entire time on the journey is like not what you've really been looking for. And I don't want to spoil it too much, maybe in a later talk, but the end kind of, it was that slap at the very end, and it stuck with me for like decades and decades. It became a koan basically that I worked on.
Sounds like a good movie. Did all that.
Yeah, yeah, kind of. It became my Zen practice before my Zen practice. Before I even knew what Zen or Buddhism or spiritual practice really even were. And it cracked open that 10-year-old mind of mine, just like a crack from an old Zen master. Okay. Now, all this was going on, and in the context of my relationship with my this is all going on in context with my relationship with my older brother. Now, growing up with him, it seemed 100% completely normal to me. And in the context of a relationship, it was completely normal. I imprinted on him, he imprinted on me. Now, the issue became for me, and it's the sort of issue that we all have to different degrees, that I took this relationship model with me from my childhood home and from the context of my relationship with my brother, and started carrying it around with me out there in the world to places where it was of less utility, we'll say. We all have a particular set of skills that are great in one context, but not necessarily great in another context. I learned compassion from him. I learned patience from him. But with this context also came a fundamental misunderstanding of people in general. As I grew older and I got into high school, it started to manifest as a sense of lack. There was just something about people that I didn't get. I didn't understand what they were doing or why they were doing what they were doing a lot of the time. And the tricky part was that I didn't really understand that I didn't understand. Delusion, of course. And we all deal with delusion in one way or another. And it's the trickiest, at least for me, the 3 unwholesome roots of grasping, pushing away, and ignoring, or delusion. It's the unknown, as they say. And the issue was fundamentally, that I didn't understand what people were doing emotionally. I understood anger and that entire complex of emotions that's always roiling beneath the surface of people, influencing their actions and thoughts and ideas. I just didn't get it, and that caused some real problems for me. In its place, to compensate, I instinctively constructed this fabulously Baroque model of how the world works, and more importantly, how it should work, which we call the samskaras. They're the models that we have for putting together the world, how we should react to people and things and ideas that we run into out there. They're basically old strategies that we have that we've learned in the past that we apply to new situations, and typically unskillfully, since we don't often understand that that's what we're doing. And I know I did. So right there, we have the goose in a bottle. The gosling was me. The bottle was a transference of the skills I'd learned living with my brother to situations that had nothing to do with it. Now, what ended up happening was that when people, including myself, interestingly enough, acted irrationally, or say emotionally, as people do, I either get very confused, very angry, anxious, or all three. And you have to remember, this is in the context of me being a meditator and a koan contemplator, kind of. But I was all on my own. There was no Buddhist people around where I grew up in semi-rural Michigan. My town was the last bit of civilization that you would encounter before the 3-hour drive when we would reach Detroit, basically. And there were no dharma talks online. There was no online, except for some people on BBSs, which I had no idea even existed at the time, internet bulletin boards. My family didn't have a computer. The closest that we got was a Nintendo. That's it. And even when I finally did get online, and as the years progressed, I discovered this really ingrained resistance to finding a teacher for myself. I still don't quite understand that whole issue. I'm kind of looking into it right now and working on it in my practice. This was, that was just the way that I operated normally. I would figure everything out on my own, one way or another. Me, nobody else. It's all of us. So, that is something I'm currently working on in my practice, like Dogen Zenji always tells us to do, to thoroughly investigate various issues that arise. That's one of the ones I'm currently thoroughly investigating. So, on the surface, it seemed like I was just a normal, average guy doing well in school. I had a girlfriend, but there was this mess brewing beneath the surface. She ended up breaking up with me. I was too dedicated to that Baroque structure that I created in my mind to really understand what I was letting go of at the time. I ended up getting into existential philosophy. Getting really dark there for a while. It was around this time in college that I got online for the first time finally. I was about 18, and I started seeking out Buddhist stuff. I remember reading that Buddhists live with the reality of nothingness, shunyata, emptiness, and that they're completely okay with it. And that sounded like a glimmer of hope for me at the time, a glimmer of hope in all the darkness. But that was all I had to go on, since there really wasn't much out there at the time either. There were books, but Buddhist books, they confused me at the time. I had no idea or frame of reference for understanding the teachings of that. They didn't fit in with that Baroque cathedral that I constructed. I read about Dogen, and that if you wanted to really study Zen, you had to read something called the Shobogenzo. And I don't think that I read any of the Shobogenzo at that time, but I did read about Shikantaza, and I did read a bit of Tricycle magazine. But really, mindfulness is what gripped me at that time. to be fully aware in the moment. I think I might have run across some teachings from Thich Nhat Hanh as well, which would make sense with the mindfulness focus. Yeah, so I gave mindfulness a try, and I really fell in love with the practice. This, however, was the time period where I discovered alcohol as well. I did a study abroad in Germany in 2001, and I picked the habit up there quite a bit. Now, yeah. So, the thing was, I found this thing that would take away this still undiagnosed anxiety that I had, at least for the time I was actively drinking. And, I was a bit of a mess at the time. I was anxious. I continued to be dedicated to that Baroque thing that I created about how the world should work. I didn't understand people still very well, and I just discovered alcohol. And yet, I was also practicing mindfulness. And when I look back on it, my life sometimes looks like a compendium of all the unskillful ways to deal with your suffering. I tried out most, if not all, but most of the unskillful practices until I finally ran all the way through all of them, and only the skillful ones were left. Sometimes persistence wins the day, wins the life. A lot of my practice in these years consisted of methods that I highly recommend you don't do. But there were a few times, 2 or 3, if I remember correctly, over my 14-year drinking career, where I'd be so focused on drinking that I'd gain this almost unskillful samadhi. It's weird. I'd be a few hours into drinking, and suddenly the walls of booze would just drop away, and all the concerns and anxiety and the walls of that cathedral would just collapse, and I just stood there in this absolute silence of self and other, of neither self nor other. Things were just so absolutely beautiful and at peace. I couldn't believe it. And this is where a lack of having a teacher and a lack of studying the dharma kind of did me some harm. So I had no idea what was happening to me. I've heard of similar situations called a moment of clarity or presence of God, but it was a clarity of some sort. And each time it happened, I dropped the bottle and I fled. I ran away from where I was, because it seemed so profane to be inebriated in the presence of this vast, non-dual emptiness, I suppose, that had opened up all around me, as not me. And now thinking back on all of those unskillful practices, it appears to me that they were like methods I was using to break out of that glass bottle. But all that squirming and thrashing just made the bottle tighter and tighter. Now, there were 2 main times over my life, over the years when my life completely fell apart. After college was the first one. I'd been planning on being a professor of German specializing in philosophy, but after I graduated, I wasn't able to put the money together, and you add to that the fact that my mind was still a mess. And after everything, I freaked out. So I ended up meeting my son's mother, and had a child together, my son Jace, who's going to be 20 this year. And I suddenly had a family to take care of. I needed to get a job. I needed to clean up my act. This is when I began zazen, my zazen practice. I told myself, you need to, you can't keep going on like this. You can't be getting drunk every night, waking up in weird places, and feeling terrible, staying up all night. And I fell back on my practice, as fragile as it was. And at that point, I'd been a meditator in one capacity or another for, I don't know, was it 20 years? Yeah. And I was still without a teacher, and I'm still rather unskillful, but I caught a glimpse or two of something very powerful. So I got a copy of The Eight Gates of Zen from John Dido Lurie, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know that.
I read that
Yeah. This is where I picked up some much clearer instructions on seated meditation, if I'm remembering correctly. And I also picked up my first Buddhist sutra, the Diamond Sutra, which I dropped almost immediately since it seemed like a bunch of impenetrable nonsense at the time. I tried, so this time I also tried to quit drinking, which I wasn't quite able to do at the time, but I was, moving away from it. And this is when also the time period where I began my dreaded job at Gentex, which if you spend any amount of time with me, you're going to hear a lot about it. So I went from an entire life where I was preparing to enter academia and to suddenly finding myself working on a factory line. So identity view, the self, Atman, all these things are impermanent, but if I didn't cling to them so hard. I tormented myself for years at that job, just so mad at myself for not achieving what I set out to do. But I had my practice, and I had these calm periods of peace, and then I'd go into work, and then I'd beat myself up, just making myself miserable, just hating every moment, just staring at the clock, just waiting to be anywhere else but right where I was. But I worked my way off of the line. I eventually got into quality control, which was a better fit for me. My son's mother and I ended up splitting up, go figure, I was so crazy at the time. And this is the same time period where I began dating another girl, an old friend who had anxiety herself. And from listening to her talk about her symptoms, I got the suspicion that I might also have anxiety. So I got on anti-anxiety medication for 3 months as a test. And lo and behold, yes, I never felt so calm other than those few periods of insight from earlier in my life. But the difference was that now past, I knew that I could replicate this peace in myself, having experienced it firsthand. So I did, I let go. Instead of running away from the feelings of anxiety, I turned towards them. I neither grasped onto them, turned away from them, or ignored them. I just looked right at them and held that feeling like a mother holding her restless child. And this got me to a place where things weren't so bad. I was still stuck in that glass bottle, but instead of thrashing against it, grasping out at any passing opportunity to relieve my suffering, I simply just breathed out and let the walls bear my weight. And when I was around 35, so about 11 years after I started this job, so 11 years in the future, my best friend from high school suddenly passed away from a heart attack. And that 10-year relationship with the girl with anxiety came to an end. So that's the darkest period of my life, so far, hopefully. Or hopefully not so, yeah. And I'd already been practicing, mindfulness with some really intense zazen, seated meditation, multi-day sits, basically, that I did while I was living with my ex in my apartment. I really bumped up that intensity of my practice over that decade. And at that point, so dark, I gave myself an ultimatum. I said, I'm going to put Zen to the test, which is a strategy that the Buddha himself advised. Don't take any of these teachings on faith alone, but put them into practice and use the ones that are effective. I've been a practitioner of one type or another for 20 years at that time. My mind was still a mess. It was still a mess, and I knew there was something else beyond my understanding. I could feel the walls of the glass bottle, pressing in on me. And I remember, I was still practicing alone. I'd never met a teacher, not even once. I still had this giant chip on my shoulder at that point about it. So I told myself, I'm going to follow the teachings to a T. You know, I'm not going to look away from this emotional tempest or storm that's brewing in me. I'm not going to grasp onto any of it. I'm not going to turn away from any. You know, three impulsive roots. I'm just going to be right here as myself, just going through it. And I pulled the goose from the bottle without breaking it. So, it's difficult to explain since the words are only secondary to the experience, but I was a mess, even more than normal. There were tears, and there was sadness, and then loneliness, and more sadness. But then I committed to leaving some scars behind. And all of those unskillful habits of body, speech, and mind that I've been carrying around with me since childhood, that entire complex of ideas about how the world is, and how it should be, how I am and how I should be, that Baroque cathedral thought that I constructed, that I assumed was me, was myself. You know, I just watched it all. No grasping, no avoiding, no ignoring, just looking. It's the same way that we practice when we're on the cushion meditating. And I discovered a rhythm and a wholeness to my grief that was oddly almost comforting. Just stepping back and the universe abides, and the body and the mind and the emotions all took care of themselves. This is the hidden wisdom, prajna, that I hadn't been aware of. Don't get me wrong, there was still great pain there, but oddly enough, no suffering, no dukkha. And the key for me to getting to this point was meditation. When you've meditated to the point where the mind can become very still and very quiet, then you're able to really listen in to what the mind is doing. And often there'll be this semi-verbal underlayer kind of like bubbling just below or just at the surface of that calm, clear mind. And suddenly like a whole sentence might just pop up, unbidden, fully formed into your consciousness. Excuse me. And when you see this happen in real time, it's hard to say that you or me was or were, the creator of that thought, since it just kind of seems to spring up out of nowhere. It happens in the mind, you see it, but it's not really you, quote unquote, that does it. It's a part of this entire assemblage that we call me, that we call I. We tend to think of ourselves as a single thing, this single essence, but we're fused together from many, many, many parts. So one night, as I was watching the pain and experiencing the physical symptoms of sadness, I heard a voice say from out of nowhere, like in my mind, I just don't want to feel bad anymore, which is true. But once I heard this, another part of my mind seemed to wake up. I'm watching this all happen, almost like a spectator. Now, this part of my mind kind of reached out and tried to take ownership of the thought that had just appeared. This is what the Buddha calls identity view, an atman, or self. This was the identity of the long-term sufferer that had taken on, it's just an atman, a self. It's just rising up from my samskaras, proclaiming itself, and then almost being claimed by my ego mind. But I caught it first. And once I had it in my hand, so to speak, I watched it fizzle away. Since identities are like anything else, they're impermanent. It takes energy and concentrated effort to maintain their illusion of permanence and solidity and control. And right then, after the identity drifted away, I had the realization, everybody just doesn't want to suffer. And right there, that was bottle gone, goose free, and it seems like the simplest, most obvious, inane, pedestrian sentiment, but not just seeing it, but experiencing it, the actual fabrication of an identity fashioned by the samskaras and resulting in continued suffering, the bottle, the unskillful application of old ways of behavior were just gone instantly. When the mind is so still, so settled, you can sometimes catch a glimpse of yourself being woven together from the pieces of your experience. And you can realize that everyone else is being stitched together in exactly the same way. And that we often don't realize this. And because of that, they, like you, like me, are just putting ourselves through lifetimes of unnecessary suffering. We beat ourselves up, we beat others up, because we don't know what to do with that suffering. Or we seek others out and we cling to them like a life raft, hoping to weather the storm. It's like a glass bottle that we crawled into when we were children and we never left. And now we find ourselves stuck. And it seems like there's no way out. But that glass can be almost anything. Screaming at your children when they misbehave, or beating yourself up when you've made a mistake, even when it's not your fault, or drinking booze, or watching YouTube all day, or just sleeping your days and nights away. How do you stop doing something when you don't already know how to stop doing something? Or even worse, when you think you know how to stop doing something, but you actually don't, and you keep doubling down and doing the same thing that didn't work the first place, a third time, a fourth time. So, how the heck do we get out of this type of situation? How can we get that goose out of the bottle? Well, instead of having Zen Master Nonsense scream at us, sit. And we call our practice in general Zazen, which means seated meditation, and we call it specifically Shikantaza, which means just sitting. And that's the entire practice. This was the practice that enables, or it's the practice that enables us to calm the mind and be attentive enough to catch the mind fabricating itself, fabricating us. So what we do, we find a comfortable spot, we put a mat, a cushion on the floor, a chair, both are good. Even lying down, I did that for a very long time. Face the wall, about 2-3 feet away, and just sit. We're watching. Not even necessarily looking at thoughts and letting them go, but we're looking at what's going on in here, the body mind. And by just looking, the mind will grow quieter and quieter of its own accord over time. It's in this just sitting, there's no samskaras. There's no ideas about ending suffering or gaining enlightenment, but just sitting and watching. This style of upright sitting, Shumio Suzuki in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, called, it was described as being aware of the universe in the form of you. To simply sit there, the mind being a mirror of the moment, that's your inherent enlightenment manifesting the calm, clear mind of the Buddha, of Buddha nature. And as beautiful and profound as this experience was, the goose coming out of the bottle, it also shook me to the core. I found it difficult to talk about with anyone, not that there was really anyone I could have talked to with about it. It was this experience that finally broke through my ingrained, stubborn resistance to finding a teacher. And I looked around for a while, and at this time, there finally were some Buddhist teachers in my area, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I didn't really feel any karmic affinity with them. For one thing, they weren't Soto Zen, there weren't Soto Zen practitioners around, and I owed so much to Zazen at that point. That was kind of a prime requisite for me. The other thing was that all the teachers that I could find were men, and somehow at that time I knew I needed a female teacher. I knew that a big part of what I needed was someone who could work with their emotions, very dharmically, kind of like a Buddhist emotional wizard of some sort. And one of the things I've been called uniformly over the years with my exes was robotic. It was an issue, with understanding and expressing emotions, which makes sense given my background. And so I knew I needed to work with someone who was the opposite of that. And one day I went on to Google and I typed in Soto Zen Grand Rapids, and right there at the top of the search results was the Just Sit Zendo homepage. And right there on top of the homepage was some lady named Shuji Mincemeyer, a Soto Zen nun. So I sent out an email, got her address, and just showed up one Wednesday morning. As I walked up to her front door, I remember seeing a little Jizo statue, like on the front lawn with a little hat and a scarf, and then there was like a Just Sit Zendo sign on the door, and I rang the bell, and in my mind, right now, the lady who answered seemed to be about 10 feet tall, just this mythic character, this mythic character answering the door like a true Zen master. And I remember her dogs, Henry and Layla, and I really love dogs. So it was nice to be able to pet them, get to know them. And then finding out later that they were also a part of her path as well, 2 4-footed bodhisattvas, basically. And after a short introduction, Shuji led me downstairs to a little room in the basement where the Zendo was set up, and there was another guy there who'd been attending for a while. So, also keep in mind that I never meditated with anyone else ever. I didn't know if my technique was proper or not, whether I was sitting correctly on the cushion, like all of that. I'd never bowed. I'd never chanted. I didn't even know we were going to be bowing or chanting when I went there. I had no idea what to expect, but Shuji just said, pointed at it, he said, watch him and do what he does. And I never stopped watching, and I never stopped learning and studying since then. And that was 2019. I rarely missed a service. There was just this sort of karmic affinity that I felt with Shuji and her teaching. I eventually learned how to ring the bells there and all the various chants. I led meditation. I then ended up visiting another Soto monastery that was a couple hours away in Battle Creek, Michigan. Sokokuji Monastery, which is another great group of people. I sat my first sesshin there, just a short 3-day one. I think it was during COVID that Shuji said I should start sewing my rakusu. So I spent an hour every single day for about 25, 30, 35 days straight, just sewing day after day. I remember feeling a little hesitant coming back to the Zendo after the protocols had been lifted. We were all masked up, if I remember correctly, trying to chant with a mask on, not the easiest thing to do. And like most places, we'd moved online, which was really weird at first, but it ended up being kind of nice. It saved me a half-hour trip every Wednesday, since we were living in different cities. My older Dharma brother, our older Dharma sibling, Sonshin, received Jukai at the same time as me. We're a bit like one of those ancient Dharma pairs you read about in the koan literature, like Shui Feng or Yanto, whose karma is intimately bound together, intimately intertwined through their study with their teacher. And whereas I'm more in my head, always wrestling with these words of mine, Sonshin is like a giant pulsing heart of compassion. Talks are quite amazing, heartfelt. They might come out and visit while I'm out here this summer if we're lucky, and see if I can convince them to give a talk while I'm here. It was around this time that I really dug into Dogen for the first time. I remember reading the Tenzo Kyokun, the instructions to the cook, and that made a huge impact on my relationship with myself, to my work. I stopped tormenting myself about it and just treated my work like my own eyeball. Don't squeeze, don't leave it anywhere, don't neglect it. It was also during this time that I ended up studying koans more deeply. I've been exposed to them, informally, going all the way back to that cheesy Bruce Lee movie. I picked up the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate. For the very first time, I dove into it head first. And the one that really had the biggest impact on my life was the Wild Fox koan, which I could fill up a dozen talks about. I'll just say that it got me very focused on interrogating my own karma, this whole process. So this brings us to 2022, almost the present, when Shuji told Sonshin and me that it was time to sew new rakusus. We're going to receive lay entrustment. She wanted to send us out into Grand Rapids and the world as representatives of the Dharma. So we got to work sewing again. Then we were lay entrusted together. And I think that's when I gave a few Dharma talks here online, somewhere about that. And And soon after that, I ended up joining the Grand Rapids Buddhist Temple, where we were both, Sonshin and I, giving a dharma talk a month, which when you're working full-time as well is quite a commitment. I was also taking care of the temple library, helping set up run in-temple retreats, so I was very busy. Real life, I would say real life versus dharma life. They're both real. Working life and dharma life. Now, it was about this time that, one of the big questions that remained unexamined for me, the experience that I had during that darkest period of my life, the one that pushed me into finding a teacher. It was around this time that I had a big breakthrough with it. The karma surrounding myself and my brother and the rest of my life, and even how it interacted with that experience. It was so complicated that I didn't have a way to contextualize it, to even begin to start picking it apart. I knew that something dramatic had happened to me, that little anxiety that I had left completely blew away. Any craving for alcohol, completely gone. That broke cathedral of thought that I constructed all those years ago crumbled away. And that underlying misunderstanding of people in general, but it wasn't until I stumbled across the Goose in the Bottle koan that I found a way to explain what had happened, both to myself and to others. At first, I looked at the koan and it seemed baffling, as they tend to do. But then I started to really look at it and feel its contours, not so much trying to understand what it was saying, but to step into it like a new suit jacket almost, like how does it fit my life? Is it too tight in the shoulders? Is it too loose in the childhood? And suddenly, boom, I go, oh yeah, exactly. This is exactly the shape of something that's occurred in my own life. It's an experience that I've had, that experience I just told you about. So I slid both of my arms into that jacket, buttoned up the buttons without a hitch, and looked great going out on the town, so to speak, with my new koan jacket. So by now, I've been at my dreaded job for 18 years, Gentex, and I was really ready to move on to something new. And I've been telling my son for years that once he was out of school, that I'd be quitting my job and going off on an adventure of some sort. Now, remember, I'm the guy that dropped everything, moved off to Germany for a couple months there, and I planned on never coming back. But I did. But back in 2023, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I looked into the Peace Corps, maybe teaching English in Japan. But what I finally settled on was living in a Green Gulch farm, part of San Francisco Zen Center. In order to do that, you have to be a guest student for at least 2 weeks, 2 to 6 weeks. So I signed up, put in my vacation time, and flew to California. And a couple weeks before that, Shuji came back to Grand Rapids and gave Sonshin and I our home leading ordination. It was a beautiful ceremony at the Grand Rapids Temple. My only reservation was that I had to shave my beautiful beard. I've been growing it and taking care of it for so long. And that was the hardest one for me. But everything else went quite well. Now, I wasn't sure what to expect at Green Gulch, but I ended up loving every minute of it. From waking up early in the morning and running to the Zendo, to cleaning the toilets, to eating all the vegan food in the kitchen, it's quite the experience. And now it didn't all go according to plan, but I had a really hard time with Zazen. For some reason, it took me almost an entire week to get the proper cushions set up. During that time, my legs just started to ache after the first half hour, ache. We'd sit for a full hour in the morning, so the second half was so it was a real crash course in studying my body, mind, examining my aversion, and just understanding the shape and breadth of my dedication to this practice. So now I've been telling everybody at work for years that I was going to be quitting in 2024 by February, and the earliest, and maybe July at the latest. And once I got back from San Francisco, I wasn't quite ready to leave yet. I wasn't ready to leave my life in Michigan behind. So I returned to work, and I think a lot of people figured I would never really leave, since I've been talking about it at that point for years. But I just kept coming back to work. I just kept feeling into that job I didn't find particularly fulfilling. Monetarily, it was fine, which was one reason I found it hard to leave. For another, leave for another job that was going to be similarly unfulfilling. So I bided my time. And I'd fully assumed that I'd be returning to the San Francisco Zen Center. I'd heard the call of Tassajara, a training monastery out there in the woods of California. The other thing to note is that since the end of 2023, my new boss put me back on the line. I hadn't been in this position for 18 or 19 years. It's the very first position that I'd done at that company, and all of a sudden I found myself right back there. And it ended up hurting me, emotionally a little bit, but physically more so. Enough that I ended up going on disability leave at the last week of March. My doctor gave me up to June 1st, so I figured I'd take 2 months to pack up and get ready for San Francisco. But the very next week, I got a call, or an email actually, from Nebraska Zen Center asking if I wanted to be the new priest in training on June 1st. So literally the most perfect timing. I couldn't have planned it out more perfectly. And so I spent the last 2 months, slowly deconstructing my life in Michigan. I donated a ton of books, furniture, threw away a lot of stuff, moved a couple of boxes into my parents' basement, and now here I am. So, in conclusion, as far as I can tell, my job as a Zen priest is to basically just be who I am, which is nothing at all and everything all at once. This twisted knot of karma, here to share my experience with all of you, and also to learn from all of you, since we're all of us, always preaching the dharma at all times. I practiced for decades in the temple of myself, in a school of my errors and delusions, until I finally escaped that glass bottle from my childhood, and I met a wonderful teacher from who would be like, Shinkyu! As Soto students, we live for all beings, and that set me on the straight path. And with that, I wish that all of our bottles remain unbroken and that all of our geese are set free. So, thank you. I don't know if I ran way over on time or if there's time for questions.
We generally, have a Q&A period if anybody has any questions or comments.
What does Shinkyu mean? Mind, heart, mind, body, mind?
It's a different shin than heart, mind. It's something along the lines of investigating reality.
Okay.
I was very into the bookish aspect of the Dharma was always something I was very interested in. And that can become a trap, of course. But at that point, when I got my name, Shuji, I was just Dogen, sutras, just studying as much. It was catching up on 20 years of not having studied really anything Dharma-wise, just focusing on clearing up this body-mind through meditation and just watching, studying karma and all that.
Okay.
You can probably ask questions out there, eh?
Oh, sure.
We have an informal dismissal, or do you want to?
Why don't we do the talks and then, what do y'all usually do, go back and do in vow? Yeah, let's do that.
Do I do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
I do have
You have announcements? Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
make them.
announcement. Big announcement right now is that we are right now doing our spring fundraiser. And this is, intended as a big part of meeting our budget for the year and being able to continue our operations here. So what we're doing this year is changing a little bit, and we have an online auction. And so the benefit for the donor is that you're not only supporting us, but you're getting something back, by bidding on the auction. So there's about one more week of that out there. So I sincerely sincerely urge all of you to go take a look at it. We have some wonderful items, some quilts made by Diane and experiences.
You can get a CD, one of my
CDs, a
CDs.
CD, and, Tyson's music, and,
And then consulting,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Consulting
yeah.
from
I have a
Curly.
country package on
career.
that.